So I think there's a question around, and I touched on this a little bit last time, about how do you awaken? How do you awaken? Now clearly there's a school of thought out there that says there is no way to awaken. There's nothing you can do. There's the nothing you can do school, right? Why do people go around saying, when they've awakened, something has happened and they've had a spiritual awakening, so why do they then go around saying, there's nothing you can do to awaken? Okay, let me shed some light on this. Supposing you're lost in a jungle, just supposing you're lost in a jungle, bear with me, and you wander around in this jungle for years, and then suddenly, you find yourself emerging from the jungle. You've got yourself out. You've made it out of the jungle after years of wandering, right? So then a crackle comes over the radio and someone says, help, help, I'm lost in the jungle. How do I get out? And you say quite honestly, well, there's no way out of the jungle. One day it just happens. It just happens. You just find yourself out of the jungle, because that's what happened to me, right? They're being quite truthful. They don't know how they got out. All they know is they got out, right? So for some people, their spiritual awakening, well, it just happened. They're not particularly conscious. They didn't take the time to kind of map out the territory that they were walking through. They were wandering blindly through it, and one day, whoa, they hit the edge of the trees and then they just emerged. For other people, they're in a very similar category. They don't particularly know how it happened, but for them, they spent perhaps a period of time with a particular teacher or guide who they feel supported them, that they feel shed some light on some of the questions that they were really struggling with, perhaps pointed them in the right direction. So their response to the question is slightly different. They'll say, well, you really need a teacher for this. That's what worked for them, so why wouldn't it work for you? So again, they're being quite honest in what they say. They're not deliberately trying to mislead anybody. They're just expressing it the way that it happened to them. So what about everybody else? What if you don't particularly want to trust to luck, or maybe you don't feel particularly inclined towards a teacher? Maybe you've tried it and you haven't got anywhere with it. Is there a way to actually awaken? Is there a process to awaken? And well, the really good news is, hang on to this bit of the video, the good news I'm going to share is yes, there is. Whoa, some controversy coming up there. Some people already be switching for the pause button. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's saying there's a way to awaken. If that was true, everybody would do it. Well, not really, because there's a caveat with that. And it's the W word. It's going to require a little bit of work. In fact, it's going to require a lot of work. And it's work that most people don't want to do. So, of the very small percentage of people who are even interested in spiritual awakening, of the even smaller percentage who aren't just interested as some sort of tourist attraction or hobby, but who seriously are interested in it, who are aiming to orientate their lives in that direction, then we're culling our numbers quite severely to the ones that are actually prepared to do the work to head in that direction. So how do you go about it? What does it mean by, or what do I mean by, you've got to do some work? Well, let's go back a little bit to one of the hallmark characteristics that tends to attract people to this path in the first place. If it's not simply about realizing truth, then the other bit that they're interested in is about ending suffering. Well, actually, both of them work in the same way. Let me just explain that to you. So, in terms of realizing truth, we have an approach to truth which could be broken down in a dualistic way of looking at it. There is the subject, that's me, looking at the object, everything out there, right? And we have this assumption that we start with, that what you see and what I see are the same thing, right? You look at a chair, I look at a chair, and we agree it's a chair, right? It ain't so, right? You need to unpack that one for yourself right at the start. Just picking that very simple example. Your experience of that is not the same as my experience of that. You're seeing the chair from a different place. You're seeing it from a different angle. It's part of a different human experience. What we're doing is we're agreeing a common label for an experience. It's not the same experience. It's a different experience, but we're sharing a label, right? So don't think because we share labels for things that we're agreeing a common experience. We're not. Your experiencing of this human experience is unique, right? So that's a big step to make. That's going to take you some time to process that actually this is a unique experience and not a shared experience. And what that does is it directs your attention away from this absolute but often repeated lie that the truth is out there, because it isn't, towards the actual direction of travel, which is the truth is in here. And those terms are very, very subjective and very relative. So these are just guiding tools rather than absolute truths. So what we do is we start to pay less attention to the objective, what is being experienced, and more attention to the how it's being experienced, right? The subjective side of this human experience. So this takes us again in the same direction as if we were attracted towards that other key message. This path leads to the end of suffering. An unexamined human life will include suffering. That's part of this. An unexamined human life will include suffering, or will lead to suffering. Now, you can't control the world around you. You can't control the events that take place as part of this human experience. There will be pleasant experiences and there will be unpleasant experiences. That's not what this means. This is about why do we suffer? And that's not about the experiences that happen to us. The most enlightened being in the world, if he trips walking down the pavement or she falls over coming out of a restaurant or cafe and they skin their knees, it's going to hurt, right? Their taxes still fall due. Unpleasant human experiences are always going to be a factor in this. But they don't necessarily lead to suffering. And if you don't understand the difference, then you need to spend some time with what is pain and what is suffering. Pain is just part of this spectrum of experiencing. It's unavoidable. It will happen. But suffering is something quite different. Suffering works like this. Here's the way the world is. Here's the way I really want the world to be. As long as those two aren't lined up, the tension between them is our suffering, right? The more we attach to this, when it's different from this, the more we suffer, right? If I need it to be this way, if I absolutely need it to be this way, but it's like this, I'll suffer a lot, right? When those two are aligned, when we're receiving, accepting this moment exactly as it is, not approving of it. We're not saying you have to get on board with it and love all of it. I'm just not resisting it. I'm just accepting it is this way. As long as I can accept it is this way, then there's no suffering. So in order to do that, you'll already see by the language I'm using, this isn't about what is being experienced. This is about how it's being received as part of this human experience. And the degree of attachment to a whole series of thoughts that say, it should be this way, it ought to be this way, this ought never to have happened. Should and shouldn't are not helpful attachments as part of this process. In fact, they're huge anchors that will kind of weigh us down in this process. So we need to set aside, or at least examine closely, where those attachments are in order to see them clearly and to therefore be able to get past them and to reconcile them. So what this does is it moves us in an inward direction. Now, having started that, you've already made a tremendous process. You've done 50% of the work. just by making that simple change of direction, by starting to recognize that this spiritual awakening is about clarity in terms of how this human experience is received, right? How it's received. So what we need to do then is we need to acquire some tools that help us develop that clarity, right? So this is moving us on to stage 2. We've already set the direction of travel. We're going to look at how this human experience is received. But what we need to do is we need to equip ourselves with the appropriate tools to really be able to examine this. And they're not absolutely hard and fast rules, but these are just some guideline recommendations. Again, the only thing to do with this is try it. If it doesn't work, do something else. But generally speaking, you'll find it works, because this is what always works. This is what's worked for everybody, whether they were aware of it or not. So this is where we bring in this word mindfulness, which is now everywhere. It's become a panacea for all modern ills. I'm not talking about mindfulness in a completely secular sense. I'm talking about mindfulness as part of a spiritual practice. So I'm talking about real mindfulness. I'm not talking about mindfulness when you eat your crisps or your chocolate sweetie. I'm talking about mindfulness as part of a spiritual practice. Mindfulness as part of a spiritual practice includes mindfulness of, really it's more focused on the inner rather than the outer. So it's yes, there is mindfulness of this form and the actions that we undertake with this form. So mindfulness of our senses, mindfulness when we're conducting ourselves in anything, giving our full attention to it. There's mindfulness of the kind of feeling tone that's present as part of this human experiencing. There's mindfulness of the mind state, so what condition is that in? And then there's mindfulness of what is called the mind objects. These are our thoughts and feelings. So there's 4 aspects to it: the form, the feeling tone, the mind state, and the mind objects. These are the 4 foundations of mindfulness, as they're called. If you're wondering where I'm getting this from, it's from Buddhism, which is my background. So what that means is as part of this practice, much of our attention, much of the day, is not vaguely wandering around some thought story that we're lost in. It's not blindly reacting to the conditions of our environment. It's actually spent being attentive to how this experience is being received. So what is happening and what is coming up for us? What are the thoughts and feelings that are there? What is the background mood against which these feelings appear? In other words, what's the kind of backdrop to that? What is the general feeling tone that sits underneath that? Is it generally positive, or is it generally negative, or perhaps neutral? And when we're not engaged in that aspect of things, when we have to give our attention to this form and what it's undertaking, then we mindfully direct that our attention in that way to make sure that we're again being attentive. Now, nobody is 100% mindful all of the time. At least if they are, please get in touch, because I'd love to meet you. But what we can do is we can direct ourselves to be much more mindful than we are at present. Why do we need mindfulness? Okay, that's the question. Why? What is the purpose of this mindfulness? Well, what it does is it brings you in touch with a lot of stuff that you just didn't know was happening. There are vast areas of this human experiencing which you've just not noticed, which you've just really not noticed are taking place. Why do you think it is whenever something silly happens throughout the day? You spill the milk, you drop something, you read something, somebody lets a door go on you, or cuts the queue, or cuts you up in traffic, and you have this massive reaction, you have this huge meltdown. Why do you think that happens? It's because there's stuff going on inside that you're not recognizing. You don't recognize all of the things that are here, that are present as part of this human experience, as part of your consciousness. And therefore, when something happens that then triggers and relates back to other experiences that you've never examined, your feelings go from 0 to 60 faster than a GTO. And you find yourself, if you've not got your hands on the wheel at that point, you're going to have a crash, right? And that's what takes place. That's why you find yourself lost in these huge reactions, and then thinking afterwards, oh, how did that happen? You know, where did that come from? I must be stressed. I know, I'll have a glass of wine. Because there's nothing better than masking a feeling. Why examine it when you can mask it, right? So, yeah, that tends to be the less skillful approach. I speak from experience. I had years of doing this, years of it. Yeah. In fact, I think one of our local shops actually closed down when I stopped buying alcohol from there. I actually do have some alcohol-related t-shirts, but I think I charity shopped them years ago. So yeah, bought the t-shirt too. So then if we take this different approach, if we start practicing mindfulness, what you start to notice is how this actually works. Let me put it in context to you. So somebody I know pretty well has recently gone into hospital for a small procedure. And I find myself getting really upset about this. You know, really thinking, whoa, you know, I wouldn't say freaking out, but there's a lot of feelings going on there. So what's happening with that? How do I actually begin to approach that? Well, this is where meditation comes in, because if I can't see it clearly, then I need to spend time with it. So how do we do this? Well, what we do is we settle ourselves into meditation. All that means is I'm going to give myself some time to look more closely at what is actually happening. We can use the label meditation for it, but there's nothing special about it. It doesn't involve me, you know, or you can if you want, but you don't particularly have to, you know, get a cushion out and light some incense and put a few candles on, and you know, you can go to that trouble if you want, but you don't have to. You can just sit down in a chair, and to help direct your attention to what you want to look at, you might want to close your eyes and you know, make sure there are no loud distractions around you, if that's even possible. So when and where you do it and how long you do it for is completely up to you. It's not particularly a problem, but what to do in that situation is simply direct your attention inwards. And what I started to notice is that why do I feel this way, right? So the next question I ask is, when was the last time I felt this way? So then that took me back to another experience of someone that I cared about being in hospital who was dying of cancer, and who died while I was present. So that was a very, very big experience to go through. And I could feel that there was some emotions there that were still present, still felt very raw, still hadn't really sort of burned themselves out, if you like, which is okay, that's fine. So that was the thing. And then the next question asked is, well, when was the first time that this happened? When was the first time I felt that this way? And it again took me back to another person who I was close to, who went into hospital, and that involved a very painful experience, a very emotionally painful experience. So what I've got here is what I can start to see is a back catalogue of painful experiences involving people I care about in hospital. So when someone I care about goes into a hospital, this is a triggering experience for me, and it triggers feelings of grief, of pain, and there's even a little bit of anger mixed in. And the anger, when I started to explore that comes from that feeling of powerlessness of watching, not in this case, but in previous cases, somebody that you care about going through something that's very, very difficult and very painful for them, but not being able to do anything about it. Perhaps nobody can, you know. So that feeling of powerlessness brings up a lot of fear. That fear triggered a response of anger as well, not being able to help, that feeling of powerlessness. So then what we develop is we develop clarity around this. We can see why we're being triggered. We can see where these emotions are coming from. And once we have that clarity, it's not that the emotions particularly then go away, but they're not in that category of this is a problem. They're just in the category of this is an experience that's happening. Yeah, you can see it. You can see the experience. You can spend time with it. As you spend time with these very strong energies, these very strong emotions, what happens is they gradually start to subside. You know, the energy starts to release, and it releases down to a normal background level. That process of energy releasing is what within Buddhism is referred to as cooling. This is nibbana. This is what that term means. It's about cooling. It's about these energies cooling back down to a normal background level. But it only happens by spending time with them. But don't forget, human beings have a tendency, like every other animal on the planet, to work on a pleasure-pain principle. You know, if something is perceived to hurt us, we want to get away from it. That's a natural reaction. If something is perceived to be pleasant, we want to move towards it. We want more of it. But it doesn't help us in this process. In this process of developing clarity, we have to accustom ourselves to spending time with things that are painful. To actually give time to the things that are raw, that are painful, and that are difficult. And to see those with absolute clarity. Because if you're always putting a lid on it, and you're always shutting it away, then whenever you get triggered, you're just going to react. Because you've got it all inside. Remember, you're not creating all of these feelings. You're not creating them from scratch. You're noticing what's already there, you know? So in this terrain of human experiencing, yes, there are beautiful serene oases, but there's some volcanoes there as well, you know? If you're going to map out this territory, you've got to really map out all of it if you want to see it clearly, you know? You don't want to be walking into a volcano, you know? You've got to know what's where and how it operates, right? So that's part of this process. This is really what we mean by developing clarity. It's noticing the triggers that will happen to you as part of this human experience. I suppose I gave us some good news earlier when I said this is doable, there is a way to do it. The other bit of good news is you don't have to go anywhere special to do it. If this has got to work, this has got to work for you in your everyday life. This has got to work for you right now as you're living, without setting any special time aside or buying anything or even a book or anything. This is free, right, as it should be. And all you have to do is change the way you're processing this human experience as it arises. And that change is simply about paying a lot more attention to what's happening, when it's happening, and understanding how and why it's happening, right? That clarity, we develop that clarity. Now, in case you're still not absolutely clear about why this is a spiritual practice, it might sound like a psychological practice or an emotional practice. It's because of where this leads us. Yeah, ultimately, when you start to see all of the aspects that make up this human experience, what you notice is there are a whole collection of processes that are running along together that form this human experience. By convention of speech, we call that me, self, this sense of there being an I. But there isn't really such a thing. It's just a convention of speech that describes all of these processes as they run along together. Now, when that is realized, when you've fully mapped this out, when you've really got it, when you see that with clarity, then the sense of a me disappears. That's when we shift from this dual experiencing of reality, where there's a subject and an object, to a non-dual experiencing of reality, where there's just experiencing happening, right? Without the projection of either an out there or an in here. It's just the experiencing happening. So that's what people call a non-dual shift or a non-dual awakening. So that's why this is a spiritual practice. Yeah? That's why this forms part of our spiritual practice. And there's no shortcut for it. Unfortunately, there isn't a shortcut for it. You need mindfulness, Mindfulness is supported by meditation because that just gives us a chance to go a little bit deeper into the things that we can't see right now in the moment. Yeah, most of it you can. 75% up to 95% of it you'll get good at processing as it happens in real time. Yeah, the rest of it, the other 5 to 30%, which you just don't get why you reacted the way you did or what triggers you, why things trigger you the way they trigger you. That's when you meditate to really develop that clarity, and the clarity creates a sense of freedom, because as you're noticing these things happening, you're not then operating in a purely reactive mode where you push this button and I do that. Yeah, but you push this button and I do this. You know, you're not operating in that mode anymore, because you're actually watching these processes as they unfold in real time. And there appears a choice of either remaining in stillness, noticing what all the potentialities are, or choosing this or that action. And it happens super quick. You know, this quantum processing that we all do is capable of doing it instantaneously. It doesn't mean that we're some sort of like passive drone that just sort of drifts through life unaffected by everything. Quite the opposite. We're extremely sensitive to everything. We're just not operating on a purely reactive basis anymore. And hence freedom. Yeah, freedom that comes from clarity. Freedom that comes from seeing clearly. Not freedom for a person. Freedom from being a person. Freedom from the illusion of personhood. Well, that's probably quite enough to go through for today, isn't it? Okay, well, thank you for listening.